Welcome. Settle in. Let the darkness around you soften. Tonight we are going somewhere very far away, and very long ago, to a world of stone-columned palaces and mud-brick villages, of mountain passes draped in cold morning mist, of desert roads that stretched so far in every direction that travelers sometimes wept simply from the enormity of the sky above them. We are going to ancient Persia. The Persian Empire, at its height, was the largest empire the world had ever seen. It stretched from the sun-scorched edge of Egypt to the green river valleys of India, from the cool Aegean coast to the frozen highlands of Central Asia. Millions of people, farmers and merchants, priests and potters, soldiers and shepherds, mothers and children and elders, lived and worked and loved and grieved inside its borders. They wore linen robes and wool cloaks. They lit lamps with olive oil. They ate pomegranates and flatbread and dates. They whispered prayers to sacred fire. They carried burdens on their backs and fed their children from clay bowls. They were, in almost every way that matters, completely human. Ancient Persia is not just a chapter in a history book. It is one of the great experiments in how human beings can organize themselves across vast distances, across languages and faiths and customs that should have made unity impossible. And yet somehow, for centuries, it held together, not always gently, not always justly, but with a complexity and a dignity that still deserves our attention, our curiosity, and perhaps tonight, our quiet wonder. This is the story of ordinary people inside an extraordinary world. If you enjoy these gentle journeys through the past, these slow walks through ancient streets and firelit rooms, please consider leaving a kind word, or sharing this with someone who might find comfort in it. It means more than you know. Now, take a breath in, and let it go slowly. Feel your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let your jaw unclench. Feel the weight of your body settling into whatever is beneath you, mattress, pillow, blanket, the warmth of it, the stillness of it. Outside, the world continues. But in here, in this room, in this darkness, there is nothing you need to do. Nowhere you need to be. Let the ancient world come to you. Let it come quietly. The Persian Empire was so large that a messenger riding at full gallop, changing horses at every station, could travel its entire length in about a week, and yet most people who lived inside it never traveled more than 30 miles from where they were born. The empire spread across what we would today call Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Egypt, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and a dozen more countries besides. For an ordinary person, a farmer in the highlands of Media, a weaver in a Babylonian city, a shepherd on the slopes of the Zagros Mountains, the empire was an abstract presence, felt mainly through tax collectors, local governors, and the distant rumor of a great king whose face you would never see. Life happened close to home. The roads were for others. The palace was for others. But the peace, when it came, was for everyone. What makes this so striking is that the Persian world was built as much on proximity and smallness as it was on vastness and grandeur. The great distances were real, but so was the intimacy of a village courtyard at dusk. Most people lived in a world no larger than the sound of their own village bell, and they built something meaningful inside those borders anyway. Persian houses were built around a central courtyard, and that courtyard was the emotional heart of family life. In cities like Persepolis and Susa, in market towns and river valley settlements, the typical Persian home turned its back on the street and opened inward, toward a rectangular courtyard of packed earth or flat stone, sometimes with a shallow pool at the center, sometimes with a few fruit trees that gave shade in the afternoon. The family slept in rooms arranged around this open space, moving between shade and light depending on the season. The courtyard was where children played, where bread was kneaded, where elders sat in silence, where goats occasionally wandered in and had to be chased out again. What makes this so compelling is that the architecture itself encoded a philosophy, that the private world of the family was more important, more sheltered, more sacred, than the public world beyond the walls. The home was a form of argument, made out of mud brick and shade, about what truly deserved protection. Persian mud brick walls were often thick enough that in summer they kept the interior cool well into the afternoon, acting as a kind of natural insulation that required no technology at all. Builders in the ancient Persian world had learned, over many generations, that a wall of sufficient thickness would absorb the heat of the day and release it only slowly, so that the hottest hours outside corresponded to the coolest hours inside. Rooms were kept dim and shuttered. Doorways faced away from the prevailing wind. Rooftops were sloped to catch the evening breeze. None of this required engineering in the formal sense. It was accumulated wisdom, passed from parent to child, encoded in the very shape of the house. This is part of what makes ancient Persia so interesting, the sophistication of its ordinary solutions, the way intelligence lived not in written treatises but in the practiced hands of builders who had never once stopped to explain what they knew. Comfort, in the ancient world, was not a luxury purchased from outside. It was something you built, carefully, from the inside out. The Persians were among the earliest known people to use decorative floor coverings, rugs and woven mats, as both practical insulation and as a form of domestic art. Persian textiles have been admired for so long that the word Persian carpet has become almost synonymous with the idea of luxury itself, but this obscures something important. In Persian homes, woven mats and rudimentary rugs served entirely practical purposes first. They kept bare feet from cold stone in winter. They cushioned knees during prayer. They marked the boundaries of a family's sleeping area in a room shared by many. Over time, the practical became beautiful. Patterns emerged. Geometric forms, animal motifs, garden imagery, all of it woven into wool by hands that worked in lamplight and in daylight, in silence and in conversation. What makes this so fascinating is that beauty, in the Persian domestic world, was almost never purely decorative. It always had a function beneath it. The line between the useful and the beautiful, in that world, was more of a smear than a border. Oil lamps in Persian homes were small, made of fired clay, and designed to be cupped in one hand, intimate objects that produced just enough light to see the face of the person sitting across from you. They burned olive oil, sesame oil, or animal fat, depending on what was available and affordable. The flame was small and constant, unlike a candle, and it cast a steady amber warmth across the walls of whatever room it inhabited. In the evening, when the family gathered after the work of the day, the lamp was placed at the center of the gathering, on a low table, on a flat stone, on the packed earth floor, and faces floated in and out of its reach. It was, in a practical sense, the center of domestic life after dark. What makes this so moving is that the lamp in a Persian household was not just a source of light. It was a kind of gathering, a reason to be close. Fire, in all its forms, meant something particular to the Persians, something sacred and social at once, something that required tending. Persian homes in wealthier neighborhoods sometimes featured elaborately carved cedarwood doors, which were oiled regularly to keep them from cracking in the dry air and which could be smelled before they could be seen. Cedarwood was imported, expensive, and therefore meaningful. Its presence in a household's architecture announced a certain standing in the world. But it also had a deeply sensory quality. Cedar has a scent that is warm and clean and slightly medicinal, and in a city where the prevailing smells were dust and animal dung and bread smoke, a cedar door was a small luxury that worked on several senses at once. Wealthier Persians used oil, olive oil, or oil pressed from the seeds of local plants, to treat their wooden furniture and doors, rubbing it in with a cloth, filling the grain, keeping the wood supple. The smell of oiled cedar in a narrow street on a hot afternoon is something worth imagining. That is what gives this detail such texture, the way luxury, in the ancient world, was often a matter of smell and touch rather than spectacle. Even a door could be a form of quiet pride. The Persians developed some of the earliest known enclosed gardens, called paradisa in Old Persian, and these private green spaces were so admired by the Greeks who encountered them that they borrowed the word and gave it, eventually, to us, paradise. A paradisa was a walled garden, carefully irrigated, planted with fruit trees, flowering shrubs, and sometimes small game animals for hunting. For Persian royalty, these gardens were expressions of power, the ability to make the desert bloom, to impose order on wildness, to create beauty where the landscape offered none. But for ordinary Persians who lived near city parks or temple gardens, the enclosed green space was something more emotional, a place of relief, of shade, of the smell of water in a dry world. The idea of an enclosed, irrigated garden as the highest form of earthly beauty runs so deep in Persian culture that it shaped their religious imagery of the afterlife. What makes this so haunting is that the word paradise, the one you use for heaven, began as a Persian description of a walled garden with fruit trees and shade. Someone, once, was so moved by a shaded, irrigated garden that they decided it was the best possible image of eternity. Persian families typically ate their meals seated on the floor on woven mats or cushions, with food served communally from large dishes placed at the center of the group. The posture of eating was low, cross-legged or with legs tucked to one side, which meant that the meal was always a shared physical experience, bodies close together around a central point of food and warmth. Bread was the constant. It was baked daily, flatbread mostly, sometimes leavened, cooked on a curved clay surface or on flat hot stones. The bread was torn and used to scoop food from communal vessels, making the hand itself part of the eating instrument. Meat, when available, was roasted or stewed. Legumes were everywhere, lentils and chickpeas cooked soft in clay pots with onion and dried herbs. Meals were not elaborate affairs for ordinary families. They were sustaining, rhythmic, quiet. This is part of what makes ancient daily life so recognizable, that the posture of family around food, low and close and communal, would not feel entirely foreign to many people alive today. The shape of a meal, it turns out, is one of the things that changes least across millennia. Dates were among the most important foods in the ancient Persian world, nutritionally dense, easily dried and stored, and sweet enough to be a luxury and common enough to be a staple at the same time. The date palm grew throughout the lowland regions of the Persian Empire, particularly in Mesopotamia, where the river-irrigated flatlands produced enormous quantities of fruit. Dates were eaten fresh in season and dried for year-round consumption. They were pressed into a thick syrup used to sweeten other foods. They were fermented into a mild alcoholic drink. They were given as rations to soldiers and palace workers. In the administrative tablets found at Persepolis, clay records of rations distributed to laborers and craftsmen at the royal complex, dates appear again and again alongside grain and beer, the daily currency of sustenance for the workers who built and maintained the greatest monuments of the ancient world. What makes this so striking is that the great palaces of Persia were built, in part, on dates, on the sweetness of that dried fruit given daily to the hands that carved the stone. Even grandeur, at its root, is made of ordinary provisions. Pomegranates held a place of unusual cultural and religious significance in Persian life, appearing in palace carvings, royal jewelry, and temple offerings, as well as in everyday markets and kitchen gardens. The pomegranate was native to the region and had been cultivated there for thousands of years before the Persian Empire rose. Its dense seeds made it a symbol of fertility and abundance. Its deep red color made it visually dramatic in a landscape of brown stone and beige dust. It appeared in carved stone reliefs at Persepolis, held in the hands of royal figures. It was used in religious offerings at Zoroastrian fire temples. And in the markets of Persian cities, it was simply fruit, sold by weight, eaten fresh, squeezed for its tart sweet juice, dried and ground as a souring agent in cooking. The pomegranate lived simultaneously in the sacred world and the ordinary one. There is something haunting about that, the idea of a single fruit holding that much weight, meaning both the divine and the domestic at once. It sat on an altar and it sat on a kitchen shelf, and no one found this contradictory. The Persians were accomplished winemakers, and wine was consumed across most levels of society, though the type and quality of wine varied enormously depending on one's station. The Zagros mountain slopes and the river valleys of what is now northwestern Iran produced grapes that had been cultivated for wine since long before the Achaemenid dynasty unified the empire. Persian wine was often dark, rich, and stored in sealed clay amphorae buried in cool earth to slow fermentation. In the records from Persepolis, wine appears as both a ration and a reward, given in larger quantities to higher-ranking workers, in smaller amounts to ordinary laborers. At royal banquets, wine was served in gold and silver vessels. In a village home, it was drunk from a clay cup. The taste was the connection. The shared habit of wine at the end of the day crossed boundaries of class in ways that few other customs could. What makes this so compelling is that wine in the Persian world was not merely pleasure. It was a measure of rank, a ritual substance, and an everyday comfort all at once. The cup in your hand told people something about who you were. Bread baking in ancient Persia was almost exclusively the labor of women, and the rhythms of that labor, the grinding, the mixing, the shaping, the watching of heat, structured the early hours of every morning in nearly every household. Grain had to be ground first, on a flat stone quern, which meant that many women began their day before sunrise, working the heavy stone in slow rotations while the household still slept. The flour was then mixed with water and sometimes a leavening agent, a small amount of old fermented dough kept from the previous day's batch, and left to rest in a clay bowl. By the time the household woke, the bread was baking on a curved clay surface or on flat hot stones over a low fire in the courtyard. The smell of baking bread in a Persian courtyard at dawn was, for most people, the smell of the beginning of the day. That is what gives this particular image such weight, the ordinary, exhausting, necessary, nourishing labor of it, performed in the dark before anyone else was fully awake. The first light of many Persian mornings arrived in the smell of grain on stone. Persian families kept domestic animals not just for labor or food production, but as presences integrated into the rhythms of household life, goats and sheep wandering courtyards, dogs sleeping near doorways, pigeons roosting in clay pots set into walls for that purpose. The pigeon pot, or columbarium niche, was a deliberate architectural feature in many Persian buildings, small clay vessels with an entry hole set into exterior walls, creating ready-made nesting spaces for birds that would then provide eggs and occasional meat. It was a small but elegant example of the Persian instinct to use what the environment offered, to integrate the natural world into the built one. Dogs, meanwhile, were valued across the empire. Zoroastrian religious texts speak of them with unusual warmth, granting them a spiritual status above many other animals and mandating their humane treatment. What makes this so fascinating is that a culture's relationship to its animals often reveals more about its underlying values than its laws and politics do. The Persians, apparently, had decided that dogs deserved consideration, and wrote it into their theology. Clothing in ancient Persia was layered, and the number of layers you wore was itself a form of social communication, warmth being associated not only with climate but with dignity and rank. The basic Persian garment for men was a long-sleeved tunic that fell to the knee or below, worn with trousers, a distinctly Persian contribution to the history of clothing, as the Greeks and Egyptians found trousers novel and slightly barbaric. Over the tunic went a robe or mantle, and over that, depending on the season, another heavier garment. For women, the layers were similar but longer, often reaching the ankle, and more elaborately draped. The number of garments a person wore, and the quality of their fabric, rough spun wool versus fine linen versus the most expensive imported silk, marked them as clearly as any badge or title might. To be cold was not just uncomfortable. In the Persian social world, it was also a kind of statement about your position. This is part of what makes ancient Persia so interesting. The way clothing functioned as both survival technology and social text, always doing two things at once. What you wore was a sentence about who you were. Persian women in the Achaemenid period had significantly more legal and economic standing than women in many contemporary civilizations, including the right to receive rations in their own names, manage property, and in some cases oversee workers. We know this not from legend but from clay tablets, the Persepolis fortification tablets, administrative records discovered in the early 20th century that document in meticulous detail the distribution of rations to thousands of workers at the royal complex. Among those listed are women who receive grain and wine in their own names, women who are listed as heads of work gangs, women who are paid for skilled labor, and women in late pregnancy who receive increased rations during that period. These women were not queens. They were workers. Craftswomen, supervisors, laborers. And the records tracked them with the same bureaucratic attention given to men. What makes this so striking is that the evidence for Persian women's standing comes not from literature or ideology but from accounting ledgers, from the dry, practical, utterly unsentimental record of who got paid. Sometimes, the most radical social facts are embedded in the most boring documents. The textiles produced in the Persian world ranged from rough undyed wool for ordinary laborers to extraordinary patterned cloth in purple, crimson, and saffron yellow, some of it decorated with woven or embroidered figures of animals, trees, and geometric forms. Purple dye, extracted from murex sea snails along the Mediterranean coast, was among the most expensive colorants in the ancient world, requiring thousands of snails to produce a small amount of pigment. Persian royalty and high officials wore purple as a signal of supreme status. Crimson dye was somewhat more accessible, made from insects and certain roots, and appeared in the clothing of merchants and middle-ranking officials. Saffron yellow, made from the crocus flower grown in Persian highland regions, colored both food and fabric. For ordinary people, undyed or lightly dyed wool and linen were the norm, but even in these modest garments, you sometimes find evidence of small decorative borders, of careful edges, of the desire to make something more beautiful than strictly necessary. What makes this so moving is the persistence of that desire, the presence of decoration even in the clothing of people who had very little. There is something deeply human about wanting a border of color on the edge of a plain wool robe. Persian men of the upper classes wore elaborate headgear, the most distinctive being the kadaris, a kind of tall felt cap, and the tiara, a stiffened crown-like form, and headgear functioned as one of the clearest visible markers of rank in the empire. When Persian officials or ambassadors appeared in reliefs and carvings at Persepolis, their hats told the viewer everything immediately. The great king wore the highest, most elaborate crown. Satraps, the provincial governors of the empire, wore their own distinctive forms. Persian nobles had one type. Non-Persian subjects of the empire, depicted in the famous tribute-bearer friezes at Persepolis, each wore the distinctive headgear of their own region: Lydians in round caps, Indians with turbans, Ethiopians with feathered ornaments. The empire presented itself visually through the hat. What makes this so compelling is that in the Persian imperial imagination, the world was not a series of enemies or subjects but a collection of peoples, each with their own distinct appearance and costume, and that this diversity was celebrated rather than suppressed. The Great Frieze at Persepolis is, in a sense, the world's first illustrated directory of human difference. Perfume and aromatic oils were used widely in Persian society, not merely for personal scent but for religious ritual, diplomatic gift-giving, and medical treatment, making the perfumer one of the more economically important craftspeople in any Persian city. The Persians had access to an extraordinary range of aromatic raw materials through their trade networks: frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from East Africa, nard from the Himalayas, cedar oil from Lebanon, saffron from their own highland meadows, rose petals, and jasmine from cultivated gardens. These materials were pressed, macerated in oil, or burned as incense. Perfumed oil was rubbed onto the skin after bathing. It was burned in temples. It was packed into elaborate containers and given as gifts between rulers. In the Persepolis administrative tablets, Aromatic substances appear in lists of official provisions, meaning the state itself managed the acquisition and distribution of scent. There is something haunting about that, the idea of an imperial bureaucracy tracking the smell of the royal court, quantifying what should be ineffable. Even fragrance, in the Persian world, was something to be administered. The Persians bathed regularly, and bathing was considered not merely a matter of hygiene but of spiritual cleanliness, a preparation for prayer, for work, for the business of the day. Zoroastrianism, the faith that shaped Persian spiritual life, placed enormous emphasis on ritual purity. The cleanliness of body and of thought were intertwined. Water was sacred, not to be polluted, not to be taken for granted. Bathing before prayer was standard. Bathing after contact with the dead or with illness was obligatory. This theological emphasis on cleanliness had entirely practical consequences. Persian cities and Persian households tended to have better drainage and more regular attention to water management than many of their contemporaries. The famous Persian royal gardens were irrigated with systems of channeled water. The underground Khanat, a gently sloping tunnel carved through rock and soil to bring mountain water to lowland settlements, was a Persian engineering achievement that supplied clean water to farming communities across the empire. This is part of what makes ancient Persia so interesting, the way its religious values and its engineering solutions were, in some cases, the same solution. Theology and hydrology, it turned out, pointed in exactly the same direction. Shoes in ancient Persia ranged from simple leather sandals tied at the ankle, worn by most ordinary people, to elaborately decorated closed shoes in dyed leather, worn by royalty and high officials. Sandal making was a skilled trade in Persian cities, practiced by craftsmen who worked in small workshops near the markets, cutting and shaping leather from the hides of cattle, goats, and sheep. The basic sandal was a sole of thick leather with 1 or 2 straps, functional, durable, and reparable. For those who could afford it, the shoe became more elaborate, enclosed at the toe, tooled with decorative patterns, dyed red or blue or black. In the palace reliefs at Persepolis, the elaborateness of footwear is among the details that distinguish the great king from his attendants, and the Persian courtiers from the tribute-bearing peoples of the empire. Even the ground you touched told people something about you. What makes this so striking is that shoes, the lowest thing on the body, were used to communicate the highest social distinctions. The closer to the earth, perhaps, the more clearly rank needed to be declared. Hair in Persian culture, for both men and women, was a serious matter of beauty, identity, and cultural pride, and elaborate curling, oiling, and braiding were common among those who could afford the time and the materials. Persian men of the upper classes wore their hair and beards in carefully maintained curls, an aesthetic visible in virtually every carved stone relief and clay seal from the period. This was not natural curl. It was produced through the application of oil or resin and the careful manipulation of a heated rod. The result was the tight, formal ringlet that we associate with Assyrian and Persian court portraiture, a style that required time and assistance to achieve. Women's hair was typically braided or pinned, oiled, and sometimes perfumed. For ordinary people, the elaborate styling was mostly beyond reach, but the ideal of beautiful hair ran through the culture at every level, visible in the figurines, the carvings, and the references in Persian poetry centuries later. What makes this so human is that in a world where so much was determined by birth, your caste, your region, your craft, the cultivation of beautiful hair was one of the few forms of self-presentation available to almost everyone. Beauty, practiced carefully and daily, was a small private resistance to the fixity of the world. The royal road of the Persian Empire was one of the greatest feats of ancient infrastructure, stretching approximately 1,600 miles from the city of Susa to Sardis on the Aegean coast, with rest stations positioned roughly every 15 to 20 miles along the entire route. The road itself was not uniformly paved. Large sections were simply compacted earth, though key crossings and urban sections were surfaced with stone. What made it extraordinary was the system attached to it, the chapar cane, or royal postal relay stations, where fresh horses and riders waited to receive messages from the previous station and carry them forward. A message inserted into this system at Susa could reach Sardis in roughly a week, the same journey that a normal traveler on foot would take 90 days to complete. This was unprecedented. The Greek historian Herodotus, astonished, wrote that these royal couriers were stopped by neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness from completing their appointed rounds, a description later adapted, much later, as the informal motto of the United States Postal Service. What makes this so remarkable is that an institution formed to serve a Persian king's need for speed became, 2,500 years later, the poetic basis of a democratic postal service. The empire echoes in places you would never expect to find it. Ordinary travelers on the royal road did not have access to the imperial horse relay system, and most people who needed to cover significant distances did so on foot, or in slow-moving caravans with laden donkeys and mules, traveling perhaps 20 miles on a good day. The experience of travel in the ancient Persian world was fundamentally one of patience. A merchant moving goods from a Babylonian city to a market in Anatolia might spend several months in transit, camping on the roadside, eating dried food, sleeping in the open or in the khans, the wayside inns that grew up along major routes to serve travelers' needs. The khans provided rough shelter, water, and fodder for animals. They were social spaces too, places where travelers of different languages and regions intersected, where news was exchanged, where deals were sometimes struck. The slow pace of caravan travel made it an unlikely but genuine site of international exchange. That is what gives caravan travel such weight in the Persian story, the way that slowness produced connection, that the very inefficiency of the journey created the conditions for culture to flow. What moved through the road was not just goods but ideas, and they moved at the speed of a walking donkey. The camel was used throughout the Persian Empire for long-distance desert transport, and the Bactrian double-humped camel, native to Central Asia, was particularly valued for its ability to carry enormous loads across terrain that would kill a horse in a day. A loaded Bactrian camel could carry up to 400 pounds for sustained periods without water, making it the irreplaceable engine of Persian commerce across desert and steppe. Camel trains moved through the empire with incense and spices, with bolts of cloth and ingots of metal, with sealed jars of wine and oil and dried fruit. The camel drivers who managed these trains were specialists, men who understood the animal's temperament, its medical needs, its signals of distress. They moved in small groups, sleeping under the stars when no shelter was available, navigating by landmarks and, at night, by stars. The smell of a camel train, of animal sweat and loaded leather and aromatic cargo, was the smell of commerce moving through the ancient world. What makes this so vivid is that the great trading empire of Persia was kept moving, in part, by the particular, irritable, indispensable personality of the double-humped camel. Greatness, in the ancient world, sometimes smelled exactly like a camel. The markets of Persian cities were organized spaces, typically located near city gates or along the major roads leading to and from the administrative center, and they operated according to rhythms of supply and season that every local resident understood intuitively. Merchants gathered in the market at dawn to arrange their goods, spread on flat mats or displayed on low wooden tables, sometimes arranged in groups of similar items, oil sellers near oil sellers, grain merchants near grain merchants, metalworkers near metalworkers. Prices were not fixed in the modern sense, but they were not entirely fluid either. A combination of custom, seasonal supply, and the weight of social reputation governed what things cost. Buyers and sellers who knew each other bargained less aggressively. Strangers were watched more carefully. Children ran errands between stalls. Old men sat in the shade and watched everything that passed. The market was the place where the private economy of the household connected with the larger world. What makes this so recognizable is that this description, organized stalls, familiar merchants, sharp eyes, children on errands, would not feel wrong in a market somewhere in the world today. The bazaar is one of the oldest continuous human inventions, and it has changed less than almost anything else. Metalworking was among the most prestigious skilled trades in the ancient Persian world, and Persian craftsmen produced bronze vessels, gold ornaments, silver cups, and iron tools of extraordinary quality, some of which were exported across the known world. The smith's workshop was a place of heat and noise, of iron tongs and hammered metal and the hiss of hot metal meeting water, and the craftsmen who worked there occupied a social position considerably higher than ordinary laborers. In Persian court records, senior metalworkers received among the highest non-royal rations, a reflection of how greatly their skills were valued. The famous Oxus treasure, a hoard of Persian gold and silver objects discovered in the 19th century, now in the British Museum, gives some sense of the extraordinary level of artistic achievement reached by Persian metalworkers. Gold armlets decorated with griffin heads, silver rhytons in the form of animals, gold plaques worked in extraordinary detail. What makes this so compelling is that these objects were not merely ornamental. They were functional, drinking vessels, votive offerings, diplomatic gifts, beautiful things made for use in a world that did not distinguish between the beautiful and the useful. A gold cup that could be drunk from was not a contradiction. It was a Persian aspiration. Potters in ancient Persia worked in a tradition thousands of years old, and their workshops produced both utilitarian storage vessels and finer burnished wares decorated with geometric and animal motifs that connected them to a much older artistic vocabulary. The potter's wheel had been in use in the region for millennia, and by the Achaemenid period, pottery production in Persian cities was an organized craft with its own quarter in the market, its own terminology of form, its own hierarchy of skill. Large storage jars, pithoi, held grain, wine, oil, and dried goods in virtually every household. Smaller vessels served as cups, serving bowls, lamps, and incense burners. The finest wares were burnished to a metallic sheen and decorated with bands of geometric pattern or stylized animal images, horses, ibexes, birds, that appear again and again across the archaeological record, connecting different workshops and different centuries through a shared visual language. There is something haunting about those repeated motifs, the horse on the pot, the ibex on the cup, traveling through time so reliably. The same image, made by different hands, over and over, as if the culture kept trying to say the same thing and could not quite finish saying it. Scribes in the Persian Empire worked in multiple writing systems simultaneously: cuneiform for Elamite and Akkadian administrative records, Aramaic for empire-wide correspondence, and eventually Old Persian in a simplified cuneiform, making the scribe's craft one of the most cognitively demanding professions of the ancient world. Aramaic, which could be written with a pen on papyrus or leather rather than pressed into clay, became the administrative language of the Western Empire under the Achaemenids, a practical choice, since it allowed lightweight correspondence to be sent across vast distances without the weight and fragility of clay tablets. Scribes who mastered both clay tablet cuneiform and Aramaic ink on leather writing were valuable beyond measure, serving as the nerves of the imperial system, translating, transcribing, summarizing, and transmitting the decisions and demands of the state from the royal court to the farthest province. Many of these scribes were not ethnically Persian at all, but Babylonians, Elamites, and others who had mastered a craft that the empire desperately needed. What makes this so fascinating is that the Persian Empire, for all its Persian identity, communicated mostly in Aramaic, administered itself partly through Babylonian systems, and built its palaces with Greek stonecutters and Egyptian craftsmen. Empires, it turns out, are always built in borrowed languages. Children in ancient Persia were considered under the protection of the household until around the age of 5, after which boys of the nobility entered a formal education that emphasized physical training, horsemanship, and truth-telling above nearly all other virtues. The Greek writer Herodotus noted with some admiration that Persian boys were taught 3 things and 3 things only until the age of 15. To ride a horse, to shoot a bow, and to tell the truth. This was not merely anecdote. The Persian valuing of truthfulness was embedded in their religious worldview, in which the cosmic conflict between Ahura Mazda, the principle of truth and light, and Engramenu, the principle of deceit and darkness, gave truthfulness a theological weight that most other cultures did not assign to it. The royal inscriptions of Darius the Great condemn the liar with an emphasis that is almost visceral. Lying was not merely wrong, it was cosmically destructive. What makes this so striking is the weight of that teaching, that a child's first moral instruction was not kindness, or obedience, or piety, but honesty. The empire asked first, of its youngest citizens, tell the truth. Girls in Persian society were educated primarily within the household, learning the crafts and rhythms of domestic management, weaving, food preparation, the management of stores, the keeping of household accounts, that would eventually govern their own homes. This was not unusual for the ancient world, but what is somewhat unusual is the evidence, again from those meticulous Persepolis administrative tablets, that women in craft production were supervised not just by men but sometimes by other women, and that female supervisors received higher rations than the women they oversaw, suggesting a functional workplace hierarchy that was not exclusively male. A girl growing up in a Persian artisan household would have understood, from a very early age, the economics of her own labor, how much grain her weaving produced, how much her dyeing was worth, what the market paid for cloth of different qualities. She would have entered adulthood with a practical economic literacy that is easy to overlook because it left no written record. That is what gives this detail such weight, the literacy that lives not in texts but in practiced hands, in the knowledge of worth, in the quiet daily accounting of a working life. She knew what she was worth, and it was she who kept the count. Marriage in ancient Persia was typically arranged by families, often when children were quite young, with the actual ceremony and cohabitation taking place in late adolescence, and the marriage contract was a formal legal document, not merely a social custom. Marriage contracts from the Persian period, discovered in places like Egypt and Babylonia where Persian administrative influence extended, detail the obligations of both parties with remarkable precision: the dowry the bride brought, the property rights she retained, the conditions under which the marriage could be dissolved, the provisions for children in case of divorce. These were not romantic documents. They were legal ones. But the existence of such documentation tells us something important about how the Persians understood the institution, as a relationship between families and between legal persons, not merely between individuals. A woman who brought property into a marriage had, in law, a claim on the outcome of that marriage, a protection that many later cultures would be slower to recognize. What makes this so compelling is that the legal formality of Persian marriage, which sounds cold and transactional, actually encoded a protection for women that emotional informality would never have provided. Sometimes a contract, made in writing before witnesses, is a form of care. Death in Zoroastrian Persian belief was a moment of particular ritual complexity, because the faith held that a corpse was immediately polluted, a dangerous physical and spiritual presence that could contaminate water, earth, and fire, all of which were considered sacred. This belief had immediate practical consequences. Where many neighboring cultures buried their dead in the earth or burned them on pyres, both of which would have polluted the sacred substances of soil and flame, the Zoroastrian solution was different: exposure. The body of the dead was placed on a raised stone platform called a dakma, or Tower of Silence, where it was exposed to the elements and to scavenging birds, particularly vultures, that would reduce the flesh to bone. Only then, after the body had been rendered into dry, clean bone, could the remains be gathered and interred. This practice struck foreign observers as shocking, sometimes horrifying. Within the Zoroastrian framework, it was simply the most respectful and most sanitary disposition available. What makes this so fascinating is that what appears, from the outside, as an absence of ritual is actually the presence of a very complex one, a system of belief so serious about purity that it required an entirely different relationship to the body after death. The sacred, in the Persian world, demanded more, not less. The Zoroastrian faith that shaped Persian spiritual life centered on the worship of a sacred fire that was never allowed to go out, maintained in temples by priests called magi, fed with aromatic wood, and understood to be a living presence of the divine rather than merely a symbol of it. Fire altars have been found throughout the Persian world, in temple complexes, on mountain platforms, in portable forms that could travel with a royal procession. The fire was fed with sandalwood and other fragrant woods. The priests who tended it wore a cloth veil over their mouths so that their breath would not pollute the sacred flame. They used long-handled ladles to add fuel, keeping their hands at a respectful distance. The care was extraordinary, the attention constant. This was not metaphor or symbol. The fire was, in the Zoroastrian understanding, genuinely sacred, a fragment of the light of Ahura Mazda made visible and warm in the world of matter. What makes this so moving is the daily, ordinary, exhausting dedication of it, the maintenance of the eternal, performed in small gestures, with careful hands, day after day after day. Some truths require tending. They go out if you stop watching. Persian fire temples were not simply places of worship in the way we might imagine a church or mosque. They were simultaneously administrative centers, storage facilities for valuables, and places where legal oaths were sworn, making the sacred fire the literal center of civic life. The temple complex was where documents were kept, where witnesses gathered for formal agreements, where offerings were made by individuals seeking divine favor for business deals, marriages, journeys, and disputes. Bringing a matter before the fire was not merely piety, it was a legal act, a binding of parties before the most powerful witness available. The Magi, the priestly class who managed these temples, were not merely religious specialists. They were administrators, record keepers, mediators in disputes, and interpreters of the divine will in practical matters. Their role encompassed what we would today call the functions of priest, lawyer, notary, and judge. This is part of what makes ancient Persia so interesting, the seamlessness of the sacred and the civic, the way the fire altar and the administrative record sat in the same room. What we now separate into church and state was, in the Persian world, the same fire. Festivals in ancient Persia were occasions of genuine popular celebration, with the most important, Nowruz, the Persian New Year at the spring equinox, bringing people together across the empire in shared celebration regardless of their ethnic or religious background. Nowruz, which translates roughly as New Day, was and still is the most important holiday in the Iranian cultural tradition, celebrated with food, fire, family gatherings, the exchange of gifts, the wearing of new clothes, and the display of a ceremonial table set with symbolic objects representing renewal, fertility, and the hope of a good year ahead. In the Achaemenid period, Nowruz was the occasion when peoples from across the empire came to Persepolis to present tribute, a meeting of the imperial and the festive, the political and the joyful. But outside the palace, in cities and villages across the empire, ordinary people celebrated it too, lighting fires, cooking special foods, wearing their best clothes, visiting family. What makes this so compelling is that Nowruz has survived every empire, every invasion, every change of religion and government, for more than 3,000 years. It is, perhaps, the oldest celebration in continuous human practice, and it still begins with the same gesture, fire, and a new day, and the hope of what spring might bring. The Persian satrap, the provincial governor who administered each region of the empire on behalf of the great king, was among the most powerful individuals in the ancient world, capable of raising armies, collecting taxes, dispensing justice, and conducting foreign policy within his territory. Satraps governed provinces that were themselves often larger than most modern countries. They lived in their own palace complexes, maintained their own courts, traveled with armed escorts, and could, if ambitious and powerful enough, function almost as independent rulers. The great king managed this risk partly through the institution of the King's Eye, royal inspectors who traveled the empire unannounced, examining the behavior of satraps and reporting back directly to the throne. For ordinary people in a province, the satrap was the empire, the face of a king they would never see, the source of the laws they lived under, the collector of the taxes they paid. What makes this so striking is that the lived experience of empire, for most people, had nothing to do with the king whose face appeared on the coins. The empire arrived in your village as a man on a horse with a written demand and a seal. Taxation in the Persian Empire was extraordinarily sophisticated for its time, with each satrapy assessed according to the economic capacity of its region, some paying in silver, some in gold, some in specific commodities like grain, horses, timber, or lapis lazuli. We know these assessments largely because Herodotus, the Greek historian, recorded them in detail. Babylonia paid an enormous tribute in silver and grain. India paid in gold dust. Arabia provided frankincense. Egypt contributed grain sufficient to feed the Persian army for its campaigns. The assessment system suggests a remarkably detailed knowledge of regional economies, one that must have been maintained through continuous administrative reporting. For the ordinary farmer or merchant, taxation meant a portion of your labor converted into a form the state could use: silver talent weights, grain bushels, bolts of cloth, handed over at regular intervals to local administrators who recorded everything on clay tablets in the appropriate script. That is what gives this system such weight: the sheer, grinding, inescapable presence of the state in the texture of ordinary economic life. Even in a mud brick house 30 miles from anything, the king's portion was always counted out and set aside. The Persepolis fortification tablets, a collection of nearly 30,000 clay administrative records discovered at Persepolis in 1933, give us the most detailed picture of daily economic life in the Achaemenid period, recording in minute detail the rations, wages, and movements of thousands of workers at the royal complex. These tablets were not meant to survive. They were working documents, accounting records, the bureaucratic debris of a functioning court economy. They survived because the palace at Persepolis was burned, possibly by Alexander the Great's forces in 330 BCE, and the fire that destroyed much of the complex also baked the clay tablets hard enough to preserve them through 2.5 millennia. The irony is exquisite. The destruction of the palace preserved the record of the lives of the people who built and maintained it. We know their names, their nationalities, what they were given to eat, how many children some of them had, and where they traveled on official business. What makes this so haunting is that the fire that ended Persian imperial glory also, accidentally, saved the memory of 30,000 ordinary people who worked in its shadow. History sometimes saves what it seems to destroy. Workers at Persepolis came from across the empire: Greeks, Egyptians, Babylonians, Indians, Lydians, and dozens of other peoples, and the records show them being paid in rations of grain and wine and sometimes silver, with specialists commanding considerably higher compensation than common laborers. This was not slave labor in the conventional ancient world sense. The tablets document negotiated rates of pay, provisions for pregnant women, medical leave, travel allowances, and what appear to be skill-based pay differentials. A skilled stonecarver received more than a general laborer. A foreman received more than a worker. The building of Persepolis, one of the most extraordinary architectural achievements of the ancient world, was accomplished by a paid, organized, internationally diverse workforce that operated within a recognizable, if ancient, system of labor relations. What makes this so compelling is that the great columned hall of Persepolis, its monumental staircases, its carved stone guardians, its impossibly precise stonework, was built not by slaves but by workers who ate their rations of dates and wine at the end of the day and went home. The grandeur was real. And so was the bread. Horses were the prestige animal of the Persian world, markers of wealth and military power, and the breeding and maintenance of horses was a serious agricultural industry in the highland regions of Media and Persia proper. The Nicaean horse, bred on the great plateau of Media, was considered the finest in the ancient world, larger than most horses of the period, bred for strength and endurance, and reserved largely for royal and military use. Horse breeding was a royal industry, with state stud farms and formal records of horse populations kept by provincial administrators. In the Persepolis tablets, horses appear in accounting records as state property of considerable value, listed alongside grain stores and silver talents as assets of the crown. The Achaemenid royal cavalry was famous throughout the ancient world, and the image of the Persian horseman, upright, armed with a bow, mounted on a Nicaean, is one of the defining images of the empire. What makes this so striking is that the horse was not merely a weapon or a tool. In the Persian symbolic world, the horse was a statement about speed, about nobility, about the kind of power that comes from commanding something beautiful. To ride well in ancient Persia was to make a claim about who you were. Hunting was an aristocratic ritual in the Persian world, practiced in enclosed royal parks where lions, deer, and wild boar were maintained specifically to be hunted by the king and his nobility, a controlled performance of wild encounter. The royal hunt was not simply recreation. It was ideology made physical. The king who could kill a lion with a bow and arrow was demonstrating the virtues most valued in Persian leadership: courage, precision, physical mastery, and dominance over the natural world. Images of the royal hunt appear on cylinder seals, on carved stone, on embossed metal vessels, the king mounted or on foot, weapon raised, facing a rearing lion. For the aristocratic class who participated in royal hunts, it was also a social ritual, a way of being seen performing the right kind of courage in the right kind of company. There is something fascinating about that, the manufactured wildness of the enclosed hunting park, the careful curation of danger. The king's lion had to be real enough to be dangerous and managed enough to be survivable, and the distance between those two conditions was the distance that power always tries to inhabit. The Persian military, at its height, was not a single unified force but a coalition of specialized units from across the empire: Persian and Median cavalry, Lydian charioteers, Indian elephant corps, Greek mercenary infantry, Egyptian sailors, a multi-ethnic fighting force that reflected the diversity of the empire itself. Managing such a coalition required extraordinary logistics, feeding hundreds of thousands of men across vast distances, providing water in desert terrain, maintaining supply lines that stretched from the Aegean to the Industry. The Persian army moved, in part, by requiring the territories it passed through to provision it, a system called royal provisioning, which meant that a Persian army on the march was also a kind of moving tax assessment, consuming the surplus of whatever region it traveled through. For a village that found itself in the path of the army's route, this could mean the difference between a hard year and a catastrophic one. What makes this so human is that for the ordinary farmer in the army's path, the great military campaigns of history were not events of glory but of consumption. The army arrived, ate everything, and moved on. The soldier's road was paved with someone else's harvest. The Persian infantry soldier, the ordinary foot soldier, not the aristocratic cavalryman, carried a wicker shield, a short spear, a bow and quiver, and wore a felt cap and a tunic rather than the heavy bronze armor that Greek hoplites used. This lighter equipment reflected a different tactical philosophy: speed and range over close-quarters brutality. Persian soldiers were trained to release arrows at range, to maneuver quickly, to swarm rather than lock in a shield wall. They were effective in the open terrain of the Persian plateau and in the vast flat landscapes of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Where they struggled was in the kind of grinding, face-to-face phalanx combat that the Greeks excelled at, a lesson the Persians encountered repeatedly and never fully resolved. But for the ordinary soldier, the question of armor was also partly economic. A felt cap and a tunic were affordable. Bronze plate armor was not. What makes this so striking is that the famous military vulnerability of Persia to Greek-style warfare was not purely a tactical failure but partly a consequence of equipping a mass army affordably across a continental empire. The wicker shield was not inadequate. It was what you could provide to 100,000 men. Soldiers in the Persian army received regular pay and rations, and there is evidence from administrative records that the families of soldiers serving at a distance received support payments that functioned like an early form of military pension. This was not charity. It was a system designed to maintain the loyalty and productivity of the families who provided the empire with its fighting men, to ensure that when a young man marched off with the army, his mother, wife, and children did not starve and therefore did not become sources of instability. The state's interest in the family unit of the soldier was thoroughly practical. But the effect on ordinary families was significant. The army was not simply a thing that took your son away. It was also a system that, at least in theory, promised a kind of ongoing relationship. What makes this so interesting is that the welfare state, in embryonic form, appears here not as a moral achievement but as an administrative calculation. Care for the soldier's family was useful, which meant it happened, and families were fed. Persian law was administered through a combination of royal decree, ancient customary law, and local tradition, with the satraps' court serving as the primary venue for justice in most provinces, a system that could be either relatively fair or entirely corrupt depending on the character of the individual satrap. The famous inscription of Darius the Great at Behistun describes a legal world in which Darius has restored order after a period of chaos, where lying and lawlessness had corrupted the empire, and where the restoration of truth and proper law is central to his claim to legitimate rule. This tells us that justice was understood as a royal obligation, not merely a function of state power. Legal documents from the Persian period, contracts, receipts, marriage agreements, debt records, survive in significant numbers from Babylonia, showing a lively, active legal culture that the Persian imperial system had incorporated rather than replaced. That is what gives Persian law such weight, the fact that it coexisted with, and often deferred to, the legal traditions of the peoples it governed. The empire did not always impose. Sometimes, strategically and wisely, it permitted. Persian punishment for serious crimes was severe by modern standards, including mutilation, blinding, crucifixion, and death by pouring molten metal, but the same imperial system also maintained a tradition of mercy for those who surrendered willingly or cooperated with royal authority. This combination of extreme punishment and calculated mercy was not hypocrisy but imperial strategy. Fear maintained order over vast distances where the king's physical presence was impossible. But mercy was also useful. A conquered people who submitted were more productive than a destroyed one. Cyrus the Great's famous policy of respect for conquered people's customs and religions was not simply humane. It was smart. A subject who could still worship at their own temple, speak their own language, and continue their own legal traditions was less likely to revolt. The carrot and the stick, in the Persian imperial system, were both understood as tools. What makes this so compelling is that Cyrus's famous tolerance was simultaneously his greatest moral achievement and his most effective political technology. The line between wisdom and calculation, in the ancient world, was rarely clear. Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, was remembered not just as a conqueror but as a liberator, most famously by the Jewish people he freed from the Babylonian captivity, and his cylinder seal, inscribed with his declaration of religious freedom, is sometimes called the world's first charter of human rights. The Cyrus cylinder, made of fired clay and inscribed in Babylonian cuneiform, records Cyrus's conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE and his subsequent decree allowing deported peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. The Jewish community in particular, who had been deported to Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, understood Cyrus as an instrument of their God, and the Hebrew Bible refers to him as anointed, a messianic figure. To call the cylinder the world's first human rights charter is perhaps anachronistic. It was also imperial propaganda, but the instinct it represented was real. What makes this so haunting is the possibility that the most consequential political document in human history, in terms of its downstream influence on how we think about religious tolerance, was written in a language that died centuries ago, on a cylinder of baked clay, by a king from a mountain plateau most people today could not locate on a map. History's great gestures often wear modest clothes. Darius the Great, the emperor who consolidated and organized the Persian Empire into its most coherent form, was also one of the most skilled propagandists in the ancient world, and the carvings at Persepolis were as much about ideological argument as they were about art. The Great Apadana staircase at Persepolis, covered in carved stone reliefs of extraordinary precision, depicts the peoples of the empire bringing tribute, arranged in orderly processions, each group identified by their distinctive clothing and gifts. It is an image of voluntary, harmonious diversity, the world coming willingly to the king. Whether the actual tribute relationships felt so harmonious to the people in those processions is another question entirely. But as propaganda, as a visual argument about the nature of the empire, it is sophisticated, not conquest but collection, not dominance but orchestration. What makes this so striking is that the image of the world bringing gifts to Persepolis is still one of the most beautiful things produced in the ancient world, and it was an advertisement. Beauty has always been one of power's most effective arguments. The construction of Persepolis itself, begun under Darius around 515 BCE and continued under his successors for generations, was a project of such ambition and complexity that it required architects, engineers, carpenters, metalworkers, stonecutters, painters, and administrators from across the known world working simultaneously over decades. The site was chosen on a natural stone platform in the highland region of Pars, the Persian heartland, and the construction began with the leveling and preparation of the platform itself, a massive engineering undertaking. Columns, some of them 20 meters tall, were carved from single pieces of stone and transported to site. Stairways of precisely cut limestone rose in gradual steps shallow enough for horses to climb. Carved stone guardians, lamassu, lion bulls, eagle lions, flanked every gateway. The palace complex that emerged was not merely a royal residence. It was a cosmological statement, a carved argument in stone about the nature of Persian kingship and its relationship to the divine order. There is something haunting about that site now, the columns standing against the empty sky, the carved figures facing the same direction they have always faced, the stone patient beyond any imagination of patience. It waited for Darius to build it, and it will be waiting long after us. Persepolis was also a city of sounds, of stone chisel on limestone, of horses in the stable yards, of water moving through stone-cut channels, of many languages spoken simultaneously, of the distant chanting of the Magi at the fire altar, and to be inside it was to inhabit a world of extraordinary sensory intensity. Administrative records suggest that during the great royal assemblies, Noras above all, the population of Persepolis swelled dramatically as delegations arrived from across the empire. The smell of incense and of cooked food, of horses and of people. The sound of unfamiliar languages, of music played on instruments that no longer exist. The sight of the colored tiles and the painted columns, for the limestone was not always gray. Traces of color show that the carvings were once painted in brilliant reds, blues, and yellows, making the great ceremonial spaces vivid rather than austere. What makes this so moving is the effort of imagination required to see past the bleached stone to the painted, noisy, smelling, living city that it was. We stand in its ruins and see silence. It was not silent. The religion of Zarathustra, which we know as Zoroastrianism, taught that the world was a battleground between truth and the lie, between light and darkness, and that every human action, every human choice, participated in this cosmic struggle. This cosmological framework gave ordinary Persian life an unusual moral weight. The farmer who worked his land honestly and maintained his household in order was not merely doing the practical business of survival, he was, in the Zoroastrian understanding, participating in the maintenance of the cosmic order. The truthful merchant, the honest official, the caring parent, all of them were soldiers in the war of light against darkness, simply by going about their ordinary lives with integrity. The Persian concept of Asha, roughly translatable as truth or rightness or the cosmic order, was simultaneously a moral imperative and a description of how the universe was supposed to work. What makes this so compelling is the dignity it conferred on ordinary life, the idea that the everyday choices of ordinary people were cosmically significant, that the world literally depended on how carefully you lived. To tend your fire honestly was to hold back the dark. The concept of Svarina in Persian religious thought, a divine radiance or kingly glory that could be bestowed by the gods on worthy rulers and withdrawn from the unworthy, shaped how ordinary people understood the legitimacy of power. Svarina is a difficult concept to translate. It was something like a divine aura, a luminous charisma that made a king recognizably kingly, visible in his victories, in the prosperity of his reign, in the order of the empire under his hand. When things went well, the king possessed Svarina. When catastrophe struck, military defeat, famine, disease, it suggested that the divine radiance had been withdrawn, perhaps because the king had failed in truth or justice. For ordinary people, this meant that the king's success was not merely political. It was theological evidence. A successful harvest, a peaceful year, a prosperous market, these were signs that the king was righteous and the world was in its proper order. There is something haunting about that, the way the weather became a judgment, the way a good harvest could be taken as evidence of a good king. The Persian farmer looked up at a blue sky and saw not only rain coming or not coming, but the favor or disfavor of heaven. The sacred calendar of the Persians was organized around a 12-month year of 30 days each, with 5 intercalary days at the end, and each month and each day was dedicated to a specific divine figure, making the entire year a continuous cycle of religious observance. This calendrical density meant that there was rarely a day in the Persian year that did not carry some religious significance. Certain days demanded particular prayers. Others were auspicious for travel, for business, for planting. Some were days of ritual abstention. The Magi who managed the sacred calendar were not merely priests, they were, in a very real sense, timekeepers, the people who told you what kind of day today was and what it required of you. For ordinary people, this constant calendrical guidance gave the year a shape, a rhythm, a sense that even the passage of time was organized by forces larger than human decisions. What makes this so fascinating is that the Persian calendar was not merely a practical tool for organizing time. It was a continuous moral instruction. Every day arrived already knowing what it was for. Water in the Persian world was not simply a practical resource. It was a sacred substance, and the legal and religious prohibitions against polluting it were among the most strictly observed rules in Zoroastrian practice. Rivers, springs, and wells were understood to be the domain of Anahita, the divine female principle associated with waters, fertility, and the flowing that connected the divine and earthly realms. To urinate in a river, to deposit waste near a water source, to allow a corpse to contaminate flowing water, these were not merely socially unacceptable. They were religious crimes, violations of the sacred order. This had obvious practical benefits. The prohibition on water pollution helped maintain the quality of drinking water in populated areas. But it also created a relationship to water that was fundamentally different from purely utilitarian use. What makes this so striking is that the Persian relationship to clean water, grounded in theology, produced better public health outcomes than many later, more technically sophisticated societies. Sometimes reverence is more effective than regulation. The underground water channels known as qanats were among the most sophisticated hydrological systems of the ancient world, gently sloping tunnels carved through rock and earth from highland water sources to lowland agricultural land, allowing irrigation without pumps or aqueducts. A qanat might run for many miles underground, dropping only slightly in elevation with each meter of length, a precision of gradient that required careful planning and expert execution. The workers who built them, diggers who descended shafts at intervals to clear debris and maintain the angle, were specialists of the first order, men whose craft was passed from father to son in communities that existed specifically to build and maintain these channels. The qanat made the Persian plateau bloom. It brought water to places that would otherwise have been desert. It was, in a real sense, the hidden engineering backbone of Persian civilization, invisible, underground, utterly essential. What makes this so compelling is that the most important infrastructure in the Persian world was the kind you could not see. The water that fed the empire arrived from underground, in darkness, flowing by the force of gravity alone. Animals in the Persian artistic imagination appear everywhere, on carved stone, embossed metal, woven textiles, and cylinder seals, and they were not merely decorative but symbolic, each species carrying a specific cultural and religious meaning. The lion was the symbol of royal power and solar energy. The bull represented strength, fertility, and the sacred. The eagle or griffin combined earthly and celestial power. The ibex, the wild mountain goat, appeared throughout the decorative vocabulary of Persian art, associated with the wildness and purity of the highland landscape. Animals fighting each other, lion attacking bull, eagle attacking ibex, appeared repeatedly in ceremonial contexts, possibly representing the eternal cosmic struggle between order and chaos, between Asha and its opposite. Even the humble fish, the deer, the scorpion, all carried symbolic weight in a world where the line between the natural and the supernatural was porous and permeable. There is something haunting about that visual world, the animals frozen in stone and metal and cloth, still fighting, still flying, still watching. We look at them across 3,000 years and something older than thought responds. Music was part of Persian court life, ceremonial life, and most likely everyday life as well, though the evidence is fragmentary, mostly from visual depictions of musicians and references in administrative records to musicians receiving rations at the palace complex. Harps, lutes, double flutes, drums, and cymbals appear in Persian artistic depictions of ceremonial and festive occasions. Musicians are listed among the specialized workers at Persepolis, receiving rations alongside craftsmen and laborers. Female musicians appear in administrative records, suggesting that women participated in the musical culture of the court as professional practitioners. The sound of Persian court music, its scales, its rhythms, its aesthetic preferences, is lost to us entirely. No musical notation survives. What we have are the instruments, the images, and the records of the people who played them. What makes this so haunting is the silence at the center of this evidence, the evidence of music without the music itself. Somewhere in the ancient world, someone played a harp in a lamplit room and made people feel something, and we will never know what it sounded like. Healing in ancient Persia was practiced through a combination of herbal medicine, prayer, and what we might call ritual cleansing, with practitioners who occupied a position somewhere between physician and priest, dealing simultaneously with the physical and the spiritual dimensions of illness. The Zoroastrian tradition recognized three kinds of healer: the knife healer, who used surgical intervention; the herb healer, who used botanical remedies; and the word healer, who used prayer and ritual. Each was considered legitimate, and the three together were understood to address the three dimensions of illness: physical damage, material imbalance, and spiritual disorder. Herbal knowledge in the ancient Persian world was extensive. Plants like crocus, fenugreek, pomegranate rind, and dozens of others were used medicinally, as documented in texts that stretch back before the Achaemenid period. The physician moved through a world where illness could be a wound, a poison, a spiritual pollution, or a divine punishment, and had to address all possibilities simultaneously. What makes this so fascinating is the completeness of the ancient healer's burden, required to think in 3 dimensions at once: physical and spiritual and social. Modern medicine divided these problems to make them manageable. The ancient healer held them together, which was both more honest and more exhausting. Old age in ancient Persian society was treated with considerable formal respect. The elderly were given precedence in seating at ceremonies, consulted on important decisions, and maintained within the family household rather than removed to separate care, and the concept of filial duty to aged parents was woven into both law and religious teaching. The Zoroastrian texts speak of the elderly with particular tenderness. Their gray hair and their accumulated experience were understood as manifestations of wisdom accumulated through a long life of truthful practice. To neglect an elderly parent was not merely a social failure. It was a religious one. Within the household, the elder, man or woman, occupied a symbolic position at the center of the family's identity, the living connection to its lineage, its history, its proper place in the world. Even a very poor household maintained its old people, fed them from whatever there was, included them in the circle of the lamp. What makes this so moving is the simplicity of the obligation, not elaborate or exceptional, simply constant. The old person in the lamplight, the bowl passed to them first. This is how a civilization decides what it values. Death was not spoken of lightly in the Persian world, and the period of mourning that followed a death involved specific rituals of purification, lament, and remembrance that stretched over days and sometimes weeks. When someone died, the body had to be handled only by designated individuals, since it was immediately considered a source of spiritual pollution. Family members who came into close contact with the corpse underwent ritual purification afterward. Mourning involved prescribed periods of fasting, prayer, and the recitation of specific religious texts. The spirit of the dead, the Irvin, was believed to remain near the body for 3 days before beginning the journey to judgment. During those 3 days, the family was expected to pray continuously, to maintain the household fire, and to care for the soul's needs with ritual food offerings placed near the body. What makes this so striking is the amount of work that death required, the physical and spiritual labor of managing the transition from life. Death, in the Persian world, was not an ending so much as a change in the kind of attention the family owed. The Persian afterlife, in the Zoroastrian understanding, was not a neutral destination but a place whose character was determined by the quality of the life that preceded it, and the judgment was carried out at the Chinvat Bridge, a crossing over which the soul traveled in the company of a divine figure who weighed the accumulated truth and lies of an entire human life. Good souls crossed the bridge without difficulty, finding it wide and easy, the air sweet and warm. Evil souls found the bridge narrow as a razor's edge, the crossing impossible, the fall into darkness inevitable. This was not a simple calculation of deeds counted. It was an assessment of character, of the quality of will and intention behind a lifetime of choices. The just, the generous, the truthful, regardless of their earthly wealth or poverty, were welcomed into the house of song. The cruel, the dishonest, the neglectful, regardless of their earthly success, found the bridge unbearable. What makes this so compelling is the democracy of it. The Persian afterlife cared nothing about your rank or your riches. The only thing the Chinvat Bridge measured was whether you had lived truthfully, and no king could bribe it. Astronomy was practiced extensively in the Persian world, partly inherited from the Babylonian traditions of stargazing and omen reading that the Persians absorbed when they conquered Babylon, and the movements of stars and planets were understood to be directly relevant to earthly affairs. The Babylonian astronomical tradition was the most sophisticated in the ancient world. Its practitioners had tracked the movements of the planets for centuries, developed predictive mathematical systems for lunar and solar cycles, and compiled extensive records of celestial events and their interpreted earthly consequences. When Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon and his successors maintained it as a key province, Persian court culture absorbed this tradition. The Magi, the Persian priestly class, became associated in the ancient world with astronomical knowledge, with reading the stars, with the kind of wisdom that the movements of the night sky could communicate. It is not coincidence that the biblical story of the Magi following a star to Bethlehem casts Persian priests in the role of celestial interpreters. What makes this so haunting is the long chain of inheritance: Babylonian astronomy, absorbed into Persian culture, translated into Greek, passed to Rome, embedded in a story told in Aramaic, and known today in every language on earth. The stars that the Magi followed were being watched by astronomers 1,000 years before the night they walked toward Bethlehem. The ancient city of Susa, one of the great administrative capitals of the Persian Empire, had been continuously inhabited for more than 5,000 years by the time of the Achaemenids, making it one of the oldest cities on earth and a place where the Persian imperial presence was always overlaid on depths of history going back to the very origins of urban civilization. Susa stood in the lowland region of Khuzestan, at the junction of the Zagros mountain foothills and the flat Mesopotamian plain, a natural crossroads that had attracted settlement since at least the 5th millennium BCE. By the Achaemenid period, it had accumulated layer upon layer of civilization: Elamite palaces, Mesopotamian temples, a cosmopolitan population that spoke a dozen languages and worshipped a dozen gods. Darius the Great built his winter palace here, and the inscriptions he left describe importing builders and materials from every corner of the empire: cedar from Lebanon, gold from Sardis, ivory from Ethiopia, lapis lazuli from Bactria. What makes this so striking is the sheer depth of that city, the idea of walking in a Persian street above an Elamite street above a Neolithic settlement, history all the way down. The ground of Susa was not empty earth. It was time, compressed. The city of Pasargadae, the first capital of the Achaemenid Empire, built by Cyrus the Great on the site of his decisive victory over the Median king, was organized around open parkland and gardens rather than dense urban construction, giving it an airy, park-like quality very different from the great walled cities of Babylon or Nineveh. Cyrus built at Pasargadae a series of pavilions set in a carefully irrigated garden landscape, palace buildings placed among garden beds, water channels, and fruit trees, connected by stone pathways but separated by open green space. This layout reflected a Persian aesthetic preference for combining nature and architecture rather than subordinating nature to architecture. The tomb of Cyrus himself stands there still, a simple stone box on a step platform, set in the open air rather than buried underground or housed in a pyramid, as modest in its form as the man's reputation was immense. It bears an inscription, translated from antiquity, that reads, "O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come, I am Cyrus, who won the Persians their empire. Do not grudge me this little earth that covers my body." What makes this so haunting is the directness of it, the most powerful man of his age, speaking from the grave in a voice of quiet, reasonable request. He built an empire, and at the end he asked only not to be disturbed. The Persian royal court maintained elaborate protocols of access and presentation. The great king was not freely visible to all comers, and the process of gaining an audience involved multiple stages of permission, purification, and prostration, a practice the Greeks called proskinesis and found deeply objectionable. Proskinesis, the act of bowing low before the king, sometimes prostrating oneself completely on the ground, was standard Persian practice for anyone entering the royal presence, regardless of their own rank or nationality. For the Persians, this was not degradation. It was appropriate acknowledgement of the cosmic status of the king as representative of the divine order on earth. For the Greeks, accustomed to a world in which prostration was only offered to gods, the sight of men throwing themselves before another man was repugnant, a sign of servility and tyranny. The cultural collision over proskinesis is one of the most vivid examples of how different two sophisticated civilizations could be in their most basic assumptions about the relationship between people and power. What makes this so fascinating is that neither side was wrong in its own terms. They were simply operating in different cosmologies. The floor of the Persian throne room was the point at which two entire systems of understanding the world made contact and discovered they were incompatible. The Persian court employed translators, dragomans, in later usage, who could move between the many languages of the empire, and these individuals occupied a position of unusual power as the people through whom different worlds could speak to each other. An empire that stretched from Egypt to India and encompassed dozens of languages could not function without people who could bridge those linguistic divides. The translator stood at the hinge of power, the person who determined, in practice, what the king's words meant when they reached a Lydian satrap, or what an Egyptian priest's complaint sounded like when it arrived at the Achaemenid court. The scope for misunderstanding, and for deliberate mistranslation, was enormous. We know that some of the most important diplomatic documents of the period were produced in multiple languages simultaneously: Old Persian, Elamite, Babylonian, precisely to ensure that no single translator's version could be definitively authoritative. What makes this so interesting is the awareness embedded in that practice, the admission that translation is interpretation, and that power needed to be distributed across versions. The empire mistrusted the translator even as it depended on them completely. Merchants who traveled the routes of the Persian Empire carried with them not just goods but ideas, stories, techniques, and organisms, crop seeds, livestock breeds, craft methods, religious concepts, making the great trading networks of the Achaemenid period among the most consequential vectors of cultural exchange in world history. A merchant traveling from a Babylonian city to a market in Anatolia might carry clay pots of dried spices, bolts of dyed cloth, and tablets of administrative records, but he might also carry in his memory a new method of waterproofing wood that he had observed in a workshop in Susa, or a story about a miraculous healing at a fire temple in Media, or a variety of onion that produced larger bulbs than the local kind. These invisible cargoes passed along the road without documentation, absorbed gradually into the places where the merchant stopped. Over centuries, they accumulated into what we recognize as cultural transformation. What makes this so compelling is the ordinariness of it, the world-changing information carried in the head of a tired man on a dusty road, not knowing what he was carrying. Most of history's great transmissions happened in exactly this way, quietly, accidentally, in the luggage of people going somewhere else. The relationship between the Persian Empire and the Greek city-states, so often told as a story of conflict, was also a story of continuous, intimate exchange, of Greek mercenaries serving in Persian armies, of Persian officials living in Greek cities, of ideas and objects moving in both directions across a permeable frontier. Greek pottery has been found in Persian contexts. Persian textiles were admired and imitated in Greece. Greek sculptors may have worked at Persepolis. Persian loan words entered the Greek vocabulary, including paradisos, the paradise garden. Greek mercenary soldiers sold their skills to Persian satraps throughout the Achaemenid period. The famous Persian Wars, which dominate the Greek account of Persian-Greek relations, lasted perhaps a decade in a history of Persian-Greek contact that stretched for 2 centuries. The wars were real and important, but they were an interruption in a much longer conversation. That is what gives this relationship such weight, the reminder that the story of civilization is not primarily a story of civilizations in opposition, but of civilizations in conversation. Even enemies are teaching each other things. The Persian practice of royal gift-giving, of distributing lavish presents of gold vessels, jeweled daggers, fine robes, and prized horses to loyal officials and visiting dignitaries, was not merely generosity but a carefully calibrated system of political relationship management. A gift from the great king was a statement of relationship, of favor, of the king's awareness of your existence and value. To receive a gift was to be incorporated into the economy of royal loyalty. The objects given were not random. A gold cup given to a satrap who had been particularly loyal was a cup that would sit in his hall and be seen by his visitors, a permanent reminder of the king's favor and the satrap's connection to it. At the same time, the expectation of reciprocal gift-giving created a constant flow of valuable objects toward the center. The system was, in effect, a circulation of wealth managed through the social ritual of giving. What makes this so compelling is that the most intimate of gestures, the gift, was also one of the most effective instruments of political control. The king's generosity was genuine, and it was also a mechanism. These things are not mutually exclusive. The Persian concept of hospitality, reflected in both religious teaching and administrative practice, emphasized the moral obligation to feed, shelter, and protect strangers and travelers, a value that had obvious practical implications in a world where travel was dangerous and provisioning uncertain. Zoroastrian texts speak warmly of the virtue of generosity to guests, of the fires that should be kept warm and the bread that should be available for anyone who arrives at the door in need. This was not merely a private virtue. The royal road relay stations, the khans or wayside inns along major routes, the system of official provisioning for royal envoys, all of these can be understood as institutionalized hospitality, the Persian value of welcoming the stranger scaled up to an imperial level. For ordinary travelers, finding a household willing to offer a meal and a corner to sleep in could be the difference between survival and not. The cultural expectation of hospitality made that finding easier. What makes this so moving is the continuity of the instinct, hospitality as survival technology, as social contract, as theological virtue, all at once. The fire that burned for the stranger's warmth was the same fire that burned for the god. Slavery existed in the ancient Persian world, but the Persian system differed from the chattel slavery of classical Greece and Rome in important ways, with debt bondage, contractual servitude, and the assignment of people to state labor projects being more common than the outright permanent ownership of individuals as property. Slaves in the Persian world could, in some circumstances, own property, practice a trade, and earn enough to purchase their own freedom. Some individuals in permanent servitude were treated with a degree of legal personhood that Greek or Roman slaves rarely enjoyed. This does not make the system humane by modern standards. Coerced labor under threat of punishment is coerced labor under threat of punishment regardless of the theoretical legal niceties. But the Persian form of the institution was meaningfully different from what we usually mean when we say slavery, and those differences mattered enormously to the actual people living inside the system. What makes this so important is that the details of how an unjust system is structured determine, in practice, the quality of life available within it. The gap between kinds of unfreedom is where human beings actually live. The Persian satrapy of Egypt, absorbed into the empire when Cambyses II conquered it in 525 BCE, was one of the most complex and culturally distinctive regions of the empire, a place where Persian overlordship sat uneasily above one of the most ancient and self-confident civilizations in the world. The Persians who administered Egypt found themselves governing a people who had maintained a continuous civilization for 3,000 years, who had their own elaborate religious system, their own writing, their own sense of cosmic order that was as deeply embedded in their consciousness as Zoroastrianism was in the Persian. The Achaemenid kings adopted Egyptian royal titles, were depicted in temple carvings in the Egyptian style, and generally presented themselves to their Egyptian subjects as legitimate pharaohs rather than foreign conquerors. The pragmatism of this choice was not lost on the Egyptians, some of whom accepted it and some of whom did not. There were revolts. There were periods of relative peace. What makes this so compelling is the effort required, the Persian king simultaneously performing the role of Zoroastrian truth-seeker and Egyptian divine pharaoh, maintaining both identities with a straight face across an empire too large for any single identity to cover. The empire required its king to be many things to many people, and he mostly was. The burning of Persepolis by Alexander the Great in 330 BCE, likely during a celebration that got out of hand, possibly deliberately ordered, possibly both, ended one of the most extraordinary palace complexes in human history, but it did not end the Persian cultural tradition, which continued to shape the region for centuries. The accounts of the burning are fragmentary and contradictory. One story says that Alexander's companion Thais, an Athenian courtesan, proposed the burning as revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens 150 years earlier. Another says Alexander regretted it immediately afterward. What we know is that the wooden parts of the palace burned quickly, the limestone columns survived, the administrative tablets were baked hard by the fire, and Alexander himself moved on. The Persian cultural tradition, its art, its administrative habits, its language, its religious practices, its poetry, absorbed the shock and continued. What makes this so haunting is the resilience of culture in the face of the literal burning of its greatest monument. The clay tablets survived the fire that the palace did not, and in them the names of 30,000 ordinary people waited to be read. Persian poetry, in the tradition of verse that grew from the religious hymns of the Avesta and later flowered in the work of great medieval poets like Rumi and Hafez, drew directly on the imagery, values, and emotional vocabulary of the ancient Persian world, carrying the aesthetic of lamplight and garden and wine and sacred fire through more than 1,000 years of literary history. The Avesta, the sacred text of Zoroastrianism, contains hymns called the Gathas attributed to Zarathustra himself, some of the oldest surviving poetry in any Iranian language, composed in a style of dense, passionate religious feeling that is both philosophically complex and emotionally immediate. The imagery of fire, truth, the garden, the beloved, the wine cup, the rose, all of these, in later Persian poetry, carry ancient roots that stretch back to the Achaemenid world and beyond. When Rumi writes of the reed flute crying for its homeland, he is working in a tradition of longing and homecoming that is not merely medieval but ancient. What makes this so striking is the depth of the inheritance, the way a poem written in the 13th century CE is in conversation with a religious hymn from 1000 BCE, and both of them mean it. Persian culture did not break. It translated. The Nowruz table, the ceremonial arrangement called the Haft scene, set with 7 symbolic items beginning with the Persian letter S, connects modern celebration of the Persian New Year to an ancient ritual of renewal whose origins reach back to before the historical record begins. The items on the Haft scene table each represent a principle: sprouting wheat or lentils for growth, painted eggs for fertility, garlic for health, dried fruit for wealth and prosperity, a mirror for reflection, candles for light. The table is set at the moment of the spring equinox, the astronomical moment when day and night are exactly equal, when the new year begins. This is the same moment that was sacred in the ancient Persian world, the same moment that the tribute delegations gathered at Persepolis, the same moment that fires were lit across the empire in celebration of the renewal of the world. It has been observed continuously for longer than most civilizations have existed. What makes this so moving is the simple, stubborn persistence of the gesture, the table set, the candles lit, the family gathered, year after year after year, through empires and invasions, through every catastrophe that history has offered. The seeds are planted every spring, and they mean what they have always meant. The Iranian landscape itself, the vast plateau ringed by mountain ranges, the salt deserts at the center, the fertile river valleys at the edges, shaped Persian culture in ways that are fundamental and easily overlooked. In the Persian emotional vocabulary, mountains mean refuge and hardness and freedom, deserts mean endurance and silence and purification. Gardens mean everything that human care can coax from an indifferent world. The great Persian myths are full of mountains, the sacred mountain at the center of the world, the mountain where Zarathustra received his revelation, the mountain passes that either protect or expose a people to invasion. And they are full of desert, the terrible flat silence of salt and stone that surrounded the settled valleys and required specific virtues to survive: patience, self-sufficiency, the ability to find meaning in very small things. And they are full of gardens, paradisa, paradise, because in a landscape that harsh, the enclosed garden was not a luxury. It was a moral achievement. That is what gives the Persian garden its weight, not the beauty of the flowers, though the flowers are beautiful, but the fact of water in a place where water is not given. Everything in that garden was earned. The Achaemenid royal table, at formal banquets, was said to serve hundreds of guests in elaborate ceremonial meals organized around a strict hierarchy of seating, serving order, and food quality, with those closest to the king receiving the most elaborate dishes and those farthest away receiving progressively simpler food. Greek observers of Persian royal banquets described their astonishment at the scale and variety of the food, meats of dozens of species, vegetables from across the empire, breads and pastries, wines from multiple regions, fruits out of season preserved through drying or pickling or storage in cool underground chambers. The king himself ate behind a curtain, invisible to his guests, seen by no one, seeing everyone. This physical arrangement was not mere eccentricity. It was a precise statement about the nature of royal power. The king was present as an absence, felt but not exposed, the organizing principle of the entire gathering whose face was available only to those admitted to the innermost circle. What makes this so striking is the loneliness embedded in that arrangement. The most powerful man in the world, eating alone behind a curtain, while hundreds of people celebrated his presence. Power, at its most extreme, is also a kind of solitude. The ordinary Persian meal was nothing like the royal table. It was simple, seasonal, repeated, and made from what the earth and the household's labor provided. And in its very ordinariness it carried a dignity that the spectacular banquet could not. Bread and legumes, fresh herbs, some oil or clarified butter, dried fruit, perhaps a piece of salted fish or a small amount of meat on feast days. Water from the cannet, or wine diluted with water. Eaten low to the ground, close to other people, in the courtyard in summer and in the main room near the lamp in winter. The meal organized the day. It said morning and it said evening. It gathered the family. It acknowledged hunger and satisfied it. It gave the body what it needed and occasionally, when the harvest had been good, something more, a sweetness, a flavor, a small abundance that tasted like celebration. What makes this so moving is not any of its particular ingredients or any single moment of it, but its repetition, the same bread torn from the same loaf, morning after morning, across a lifetime. The ordinary meal is not what you remember, and it is everything. Children in Persian households learned through watching before they learned through instruction, observing the prayers at the fire altar, the kneading of bread, the watering of the courtyard garden, the care of animals, absorbing the rhythms of adult life through sustained proximity before they were old enough to be taught them formally. This apprenticeship of watching is how most of the skilled knowledge of the ancient world was transmitted, not through books or formal schooling, but through the long patient attention of a child beside a working adult. The potter's child watched the wheel. The weaver's child watched the loom. The farmer's child watched the sowing and the cutting and the storing. The priest's child watched the fire. At some point, not marked by any ceremony, not remembered as a distinct event, the watching became doing, and the child became a practitioner of something that their parent had not consciously taught them and could not have articulated as a curriculum. What makes this so haunting is the intimacy of it, knowledge so deeply held that it could not be described, only demonstrated. The most important lessons of the ancient world left no written record. The relationship between Persian men and their adult sons was shaped by the demands of an imperial system that required loyalty both to family and to the state, and the records of Persian history contain enough examples of fathers executing sons on royal command, and sons betraying fathers for political advantage, to suggest that this tension was real and sometimes catastrophic. The Achaemenid royal family in particular was beset by a pattern of succession violence, brothers killing brothers, sons plotting against aging fathers, mothers wielding influence behind the scenes in increasingly dangerous palace intrigues that grew worse as the dynasty aged. For ordinary families, the parallel demands of household loyalty and imperial obligation were less lethal but still present. A son conscripted into the army was a son removed from the family's labor force. A son who attracted the attention of a satrap's administrators could be an asset or a liability depending on the quality of the official. What makes this so striking is the way that the empire, vast and abstract, felt mainly through taxation and conscription, arrived in the most intimate spaces of family life and made its demands there too. The king never came to your village, but his requirements walked in through your door. Persian women of the royal and aristocratic classes were not confined to domestic space. They traveled, managed estates, led administrative organizations, and appeared in public in ways that suggest a considerably more active social presence than the usual ancient world stereotype of feminine seclusion. The royal women of the Achaemenid period, the queen mother, the king's principal wives, the senior royal daughters, appear in administrative records as the heads of substantial economic enterprises, managing estates with hundreds of workers, traveling with armed retinues between the empire's capitals, and in some cases exercising what amounted to independent political influence. Queen Atossa, mother of Xerxes and wife of Darius, appears in Greek accounts as a woman of formidable intelligence and political will. The Persepolis tablets record female supervisors of work gangs receiving rations in their own names, making independent economic decisions. What makes this so compelling is that the evidence suggests Persian women's social space was more complex and more active than the official ideological picture, a gap, as always, between how a society represents itself and how it actually functions. The tablets are more honest than the palace carvings. The Magi, the Persian priestly caste, were not simply religious functionaries but intellectuals who maintained specialized knowledge of astronomy, healing, dream interpretation, and law, serving the empire as its most important class of technical specialists. The Magi appear in Greek sources as mysterious, sinister, wise, figures of arcane knowledge who could interpret the hidden meaning of events, who knew the language of dreams, who could mediate between the human and the divine. This reputation was not entirely projection. The Magi maintained bodies of knowledge that were genuinely specialized and genuinely useful, and they transmitted this knowledge through an educational system entirely separate from the general population. A young man born into the Magi caste entered a world of learning that encompassed theology, ritual practice, astronomical observation, medicinal botany, and the complex regulations of purity that govern Zoroastrian daily life. This knowledge was their power, and they guarded it carefully. There is something haunting about that, the whole system of knowledge that was never written down, or was written down and lost. The Magi knew things we will never know, and they took their knowing with them. The great empire that Cyrus built and Darius organized was not a simple extraction machine. It produced real goods for its subjects, including the security of maintained roads, suppressed local banditry, standardized weights and measures that facilitated trade, and the kind of predictable legal environment in which commerce could plan ahead. This is easy to forget when we focus on the taxation and the military coercion. The Pax Persica, the Persian peace, the period of relative stability across the vast empire, was a real phenomenon with real economic consequences. A merchant trading between Babylon and Sardis in the Achaemenid period operated within a known legal framework, could appeal to courts with recognized authority, traveled roads maintained by the state, and used weights that were standardized across the empire's extent. The transaction costs of long-distance trade were lower than they would have been in a world of constant local warfare and unpredictable law. What makes this so interesting is that the empire's greatest gift to ordinary commerce was not any single policy but stability, the boring, unglamorous, enormously valuable fact of being able to plan. Order is underrated by those who have never lived without it. The Persian administrative system required literacy and numeracy from a substantial class of officials, not just professional scribes but provincial administrators, tax collectors, military quartermasters, estate managers, and temple officials, creating a world in which written record-keeping was woven into the fabric of daily economic life. This demand for administrative literacy was one of the more quietly revolutionary aspects of the Persian Empire. In earlier periods, writing had been largely a specialized craft practiced by dedicated scribes in palace and temple contexts. The imperial system required a much broader base of people who could read a document, check a figure, and understand what a clay tablet record meant. This created educational pressure at the middle levels of Persian society, the sons of minor officials and temple administrators who needed enough literacy to carry out the family's work. Whether this literacy filtered into wider society in any significant way is hard to know, but the imperial demand for it shaped the educational priorities of a significant class of people. What makes this so fascinating is that bureaucratic necessity often drives cultural change more powerfully than ideology or aspiration. The empire needed readers, and so it produced them. The Persian Empire officially ended with the conquest of Alexander the Great between 334 and 323 BCE, but the culture, the language, the religious tradition, the artistic vocabulary, and the administrative habits of the Achaemenid world survived the conquest and, in many ways, absorbed their conqueror. Alexander himself adopted Persian court dress. His successors, the Seleucids, governed a largely Persian administrative system staffed by Persian officials using Persian methods. The Parthian and Sasanian empires that followed the Seleucids were Persian in cultural identity, even when they spoke different languages and practiced modified forms of the Old Faith. When Islam arrived in the 7th century CE, the Persian cultural tradition absorbed it too, and Persian language Islamic civilization became one of the most brilliant in the medieval world, producing Rumi, Hafez, Avicenna, Omar Khayyam, and the architecture of Isfahan. The culture did not simply continue. It transformed and persisted. What makes this so striking is the sheer, stubborn vitality of it, the Persian world that refused to end, that translated itself through every catastrophe into the next era. You cannot conquer a thing that knows how to become something else. The evening in an ancient Persian household, as the lamp was lit and the family gathered and the day's labor ended, was probably not so different, in its emotional texture, from an evening anywhere and anywhen, the tired body settling, the smell of bread or stew or smoke, the voices of familiar people in familiar rhythms, the particular intimacy of people who have shared a small space through many seasons. This is the thing that pulls at attention, across all the distance of history, the moments of ordinariness, the evenings, the mornings, the meals, the silences. The Persian farmer finishing a day in the highland fields and walking back to his stone-floored house as the sky went red and cold. The weaver in a Babylonian city quarter laying down the shuttle as the light failed and calling her children in from the alley. The young soldier on campaign, wrapping himself in his cloak against the night air and thinking about wherever it was he called home. They are not us. But they are not entirely not us. What makes this so compelling is the intimacy of the connection, not the kings, not the battles, not the carved stone and the gold vessels, but the evening itself, the light failing, the need for warmth. This is what connects us to the ancient world, not achievement, but the end of the day. The Zoroastrian prayer known as the Asham Vohu, righteousness is good, it is the highest good, was and still is recited by Zoroastrians multiple times daily, a short utterance of such antiquity that it may be among the oldest texts in continuous liturgical use in any living religious tradition. The words are simple and old, composed in an archaic form of the Iranian language that dates to a period perhaps contemporary with the oldest Vedic Sanskrit. They have been said aloud, softly and daily, by millions of people across more than 3,000 years, in fire temples and in kitchens, in palaces and in hovels, before bed and upon waking. The Magi said them. Cyrus may have said them. The workers at Persepolis who received their date rations and went to their sleeping places almost certainly said them. And somewhere in the world tonight, someone is saying them. That is what gives this detail such quiet weight, the thread of sound running unbroken from the ancient world to this one. The prayer that someone said in a stone courtyard 3,000 years ago is still being said. Food preservation in the ancient Persian world was a matter of survival planning, and the techniques used, salting, drying, fermenting, pickling in vinegar or brine, storing in sealed clay jars or underground cool rooms, were sophisticated enough to keep provisions available through the months when fresh food was scarce. The cold rooms, simple underground chambers whose temperature remained relatively stable through the extremes of the plateau's seasonal temperature swings, could keep oil, wine, and certain preserved foods edible for months. Clay storage jars sealed with natural bitumen or clay stoppers were effective containers for grain, oil, and dried fruits. The salting of fish from the great rivers and the Caspian Sea created a preserved protein that could travel and last. A well-provisioned household entering the winter months had made a series of calculated investments across the harvest season, dried this, fermented that, stored these, that would determine whether the cold months were manageable or desperate. What makes this so human is the anxiety embedded in the provision, the awareness that the future is hungry, and that the present moment of abundance must be used against it. Every jar sealed against the winter was a small act of hope. The experience of rain in the Persian highland world was not a backdrop or a nuisance but an event of genuine significance, welcomed with something close to religious feeling in a landscape that received most of its annual precipitation in a short, intense winter season. The Persian highlands could be brutally dry in summer, the earth cracked, the pastures browned, the springs reduced to trickles, and then, in the late autumn, the rains came from the west, heavy and cold, filling the streams, recharging the qanats, greening the hillsides with the small sudden surge of growth that preceded winter. For farmers, the timing and quantity of that rain was the most consequential event of the year. A late rain could save a harvest, an absent one could destroy a family. Rain was therefore prayed for, watched for, interpreted. When it came, the smell of it on hot dry earth, petrichor, we call it now, was the smell of the world being renewed. There is something haunting about that smell, about the way even a person who has never heard of ancient Persia knows exactly what that first rain on dry earth smells like. Some things do not require translation. The concept of the garden, in Persian culture, was not just a physical space but a philosophical one. The idea of the paradisa as a model of ordered beauty, of human care imposed upon wild nature, became a metaphor for governance, for the spiritual life, and eventually for paradise itself. In the Zoroastrian understanding of the world, matter was not evil but sacred, capable of being made more beautiful and more ordered through human effort. The garden was the physical expression of this belief, water guided through channels, earth tended and fed, plants chosen and placed, the wild possibilities of growth given shape and direction. A good garden was not a defeat of nature but a collaboration with it, the human skill of irrigation and selection working in partnership with the earth's own generosity. The emperor who made the desert bloom was doing the same work as the farmer who kept his kennel running. What makes this so beautiful is the continuity of the metaphor, from a hole in the ground through which water flows, to the idea of paradise. The garden said, with enough care, even this can be made to flourish. Trade goods from across the ancient world moved through the Persian Empire, and the variety of objects that turn up in Persian archaeological contexts, Chinese silk fragments, Indian ivory, Egyptian faience, Scythian gold work, Greek pottery, Baltic amber, speaks to the extraordinary reach of the trading networks that the Persian road system both facilitated and depended on. The empire was not merely a political entity. It was an economic one, perhaps the largest free trade zone the world had yet seen, with common weights, common administrative language, recognized courts, and maintained roads enabling commerce across distances that would have been prohibitive without those shared systems. Objects moved along those routes not just through formal state commerce but through the informal networks of merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and travelers who carried small things as gifts, as personal property, as trade goods. Amber from the shores of the Baltic Sea, passed from hand to hand across 1,000 miles of steppe, arrived eventually in the workshops of Persian craftsmen who did not know where it had come from. What makes this so fascinating is that globalization, in its most basic form, the movement of goods, people, and ideas across continental distances, is not a modern invention. The ancient world was already connected. It just moved more slowly. The practice of keeping royal game parks, the hunted enclosures called paradisa, was also, for the Persian nobility, a practice of maintaining a kind of curated wilderness, a corner of the world held apart from human settlement where the ancient relationship between hunter and prey could be periodically enacted. The game parks were stocked with lions, deer, wild boar, and other animals, some imported from distant parts of the empire. They were maintained by specialized park keepers whose knowledge of the animals, their behaviors, their needs, and territories was both practical and lore-laden. For the king who hunted there, the park was a theater of virtuous violence, a space where royal qualities could be demonstrated in a controlled environment. For the park keepers who lived there year-round, caring for animals they would eventually help kill, it was simply a life, a strange, specific, skilled life at the edge of the cultivated world. What makes this so interesting is the invisible labor behind the spectacle, the keeper who fed the lion that the king killed, whose skill made the king's courage possible, who is not in any of the carved reliefs but without whom nothing would have happened. Every performance of power requires a backstage. The spoken word was the primary medium of cultural transmission in the ancient Persian world. Stories, Laws, religious teachings, family histories, agricultural knowledge, and moral instruction all traveled first through oral recitation rather than written text, making the memory and the voice the most important cultural technologies of ordinary life. Even after writing was established in Persian administrative contexts, the oral tradition remained primary for most people. The Zoroastrian Gathas were recited rather than read, committed to memory by priests who trained for years to hold the ancient words precisely, without error, because the words themselves were sacred and could not be corrupted. Family histories were passed through storytelling in the evenings. Agricultural wisdom moved from elder to younger through conversation and demonstration. The law was proclaimed aloud in the marketplace. Even the royal inscriptions of Darius, carved into rock faces at Behistun for anyone to see, were understood to be primarily messages to the gods, since only a small fraction of the population who encountered them could have read them. What makes this so striking is the dependence on memory in a world without external storage, the weight placed on the human mind as the primary repository of everything that mattered. The archive, for most people in the ancient world, was inside the skull. The collapse of the Achaemenid Empire under Alexander's assault between 334 and 323 BCE brought genuine disruption and suffering to millions of ordinary people, disrupted trade routes, burning cities, the end of familiar administrative systems, and yet the material evidence suggests that life in most Persian territories continued with relatively little visible change. Cities were not depopulated. Fields continued to be farmed. Craftspeople continued their crafts. The Khanate systems continued to flow. The change of ruler at the top of a system of imperial governance rarely meant immediate transformation in the lives of people several administrative layers below, especially in the vast agricultural regions that formed the economic base of the empire. What changed was the language of administration, the identity of the officials, the direction of the tax flow. What did not change, immediately, was the bread baking in the courtyard at dawn. What makes this so compelling is the resilience of ordinary life beneath the turbulence of political history, the way that people continue to do the necessary things, the daily things, regardless of who has declared themselves king. History happens at the top, and the bread gets made at the bottom, and the distance between those two facts is where most people actually live. The long evenings of the Persian winter, when darkness came early and the lamplight was the center of the domestic world, were times of storytelling, of singing, of repair work done by hand in the warm light, of the kind of quiet conversation that close quarters and shared warmth produce between people who know each other well. The lamp in the corner. The smell of the oil burning in the bread from earlier and the wool stored against the wall. The voices, lower than in daylight, adapted to the smallness of the room, to the presence of children half asleep in the corner. The elder's face in the lamplight, telling something, a story, a prayer, a piece of accumulated wisdom that needed to go somewhere before it was lost. This is a domestic image that has no nationality, no era, no religion. It is just the winter evening, the lamplight, the family, the warmth, the voices. And it happened, in rooms we will never enter, for centuries upon centuries in the Persian world. What makes this so haunting is not its foreignness but its familiarity, the way that the inside of a winter evening is the same inside in every era, in every language, in every part of the world. The lamp is different. The darkness is the same. The need for warmth and story and the sound of familiar voices is exactly the same. The Persian world ended and did not end. Its empire fell. Its language changed. Its faith absorbed other faiths and was itself absorbed. Its royal line vanished. Its great palace complex at Persepolis became a field of broken columns. And yet, the garden persisted, and the fire, and the prayer said in the early morning before the household was awake, and the bread kneaded before dawn, and the cannet flowing quietly underground, and the pomegranate on the table, and the rug on the floor, and the lamp in the corner, and the story told in the long winter evening. This is what survives empires. Not the thrones. Not the armies. Not the tax records, though those too, improbably, in their baked clay form, survived. What survives is the small persistence of daily practice, the things you do because they are necessary, or because they are beautiful, or because your mother did them, or because they make the cold evening bearable. The Persians were great because they built something vast. They matter because they also built something small, a way of living in a difficult world with dignity and warmth and some beauty in the corners. What makes this so moving, finally, is not the empire but the garden, the small enclosed space made to bloom by human care in a landscape that would otherwise offer nothing. They made something flourish. And some of it is still growing. Somewhere, a long time ago, in a courtyard you will never see, a lamp was lit against the coming dark. The family gathered around it. The bread was torn and passed. The fire was tended. The stars came out over the Zagros mountains, the same stars that come out over wherever you are tonight. Someone said a prayer in a language no one speaks anymore, and the prayer meant something true, and the truth is still true, even now, even here. That is ancient Persia. Not the gold. Not the armies. Not the inscriptions carved into the face of the rock for the gods to read. But the lamp, and the bread, and the family around it, and the fire maintained through the night by careful hands, and the conviction that the truth matters and that the world, with enough care, can be made to flourish. You have traveled a very long way tonight. Rest now. Let the ancient world recede into the comfortable distance of sleep. Let the lamplight fade. Let the fire burn low. Let whatever worries you carries about tomorrow or yesterday grow quiet in the way that things grow quiet when they are finally, gently, given permission to be still. The morning will come, as it always does. But for now, this dark, this warmth, this quiet. Sleep well. If this journey through the ancient world offered you some peace or wonder, please consider sharing it with someone who might find rest in these quiet histories. Thank you for listening.